I never imagined that a quiet Wednesday afternoon would turn into a whirlwind of betrayal and deceit. It was supposed to be an ordinary day at the office, but as I walked past Laura's desk and glanced at her computer screen, my world shattered into a million pieces. The open email on her screen was from Charlie, her business partner. The subject line read, "Last night's meeting." The contents of the email were innocent enough, but a single attachment, an image of Laura and Charlie together in a restaurant, left no room for doubt. Their smiles, too intimate, too familiar, pierced through the facade of my perfect life. My heart pounded as I realized that Laura, the woman I thought I knew inside and out, had been hiding something far more sinister than just a work-related secret. The image wasn't just a snapshot of a dinner, it was a snapshot of their clandestine affair. My stomach churned with rage and disbelief. The gut-wrenching reality sank in as I understood that Charlie wasn't just her colleague but had become a significant part of our lives in the most intimate way. I needed to act. I couldn't confront Laura yet, no, not before I had solid proof of her betrayal. The rage inside me demanded action, and revenge became the only way to quell the storm within. I decided that if Charlie was going to take my wife, he would have to face the consequences. The following days were a blur of calculated moves and hidden surveillance. I started by tracking Charlie's daily routines. I installed discreet cameras near his office and set up listening devices in places he frequented. I needed to gather as much information as possible to ensure that when I struck, it would be with undeniable force. Each night, as I reviewed the footage and listened to Charlie's conversations, I felt a perverse sense of satisfaction. The more I uncovered, the more I convinced myself that my actions were justified. Charlie's arrogance and the ease with which he spoke about his conquests only fueled my desire for revenge. But with every new piece of evidence I collected, I began to feel a gnawing unease. I was sinking into a moral quagmire, driven by a desire for vengeance that seemed to overshadow all reason. Little did I know that this pursuit would soon ensnare me in a web of my own making, and the cost of my revenge would be far greater than I had ever anticipated. As I prepared for my next move, I was blissfully unaware that the very tactics I was employing to destroy Charlie would eventually come back to haunt me. The path I had chosen was one of destruction and chaos, and I was only at the beginning of this dark journey. Days turned into weeks, and I continued my covert operation against Charlie. My initial anger had evolved into a more methodical rage. Every day, I sifted through footage, searching for any compromising material that could be used to expose Charlie's betrayal. The more I delved into his life, the more I discovered his shady dealings and questionable ethics. I thought I had all the ammunition I needed to strike a decisive blow. But the more I uncovered, the more I felt a growing sense of paranoia. Charlie's every move seemed to be a potential threat. I began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. His phone calls were more guarded, his conversations more cryptic. It was as if he was aware that someone was watching him. My gut told me that he was onto me. One evening, as I was reviewing the latest batch of footage, I saw Charlie meeting with a man I didn't recognize. The sight of Charlie meeting with an unfamiliar man set my nerves on edge. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this a new ally or a confidant? I watched intently as they exchanged briefcases and hushed words in a secluded park. The secrecy of the meeting suggested that whatever they were discussing was significant. I decided to follow Charlie and the stranger, keeping a safe distance. They drove to a high-end hotel, checking in under aliases. My heart pounded as I realized this could be the opportunity to uncover something that would give me the upper hand. I spent the night in my car, outside the hotel, waiting for any sign of what was happening inside. As dawn broke, Charlie emerged alone, looking visibly agitated. The stranger had vanished without a trace. My mind raced with theories. Were they conspiring against me? Or was this just another layer of deception in Charlie's already tangled web? Back at home, I reviewed the footage from the hotel lobby. It was then that I noticed a crucial detail. Charlie's briefcase, left unattended for a brief moment, was filled with documents and a laptop. I had to get my hands on that briefcase. If Charlie was hiding something, this could be the breakthrough I needed. That afternoon, I executed a risky plan. I managed to sneak into the hotel and, using a combination of stealth and luck, I retrieved the briefcase from Charlie's room. My hands trembled as I examined its contents. Inside were contracts, financial statements, and an encrypted USB drive. I felt a surge of satisfaction. This was more than I had hoped for. However, my triumph was short-lived. As I was about to leave, I noticed a shadowy figure watching me from a distance. My heart skipped a beat. Had Charlie's paranoia extended to hiring private investigators, or had I missed something critical? I hurried back to my car and drove home with a sense of unease. As I sat down to examine the documents, I realized that the encrypted drive might contain crucial evidence. But my thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected phone call. It was Charlie. His voice, cold and calculating, was on the other end of the line. "Ben," he said, "I think you've been busy. I've seen you poking around. Let's talk." Panic surged through me. Charlie knew I was after him, and it was only a matter of time before he struck back. My quest for revenge had taken a dangerous turn, and now, I was at the mercy of his next move. Charlie's words echoed in my mind long after the call ended. I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath me was crumbling. He knew I had been digging into his life, and now, he was ready to make his move. But what was he planning? Was this a bluff, or had I underestimated him? I had no choice but to meet him. Ignoring Charlie's call would only make me look weak, and I wasn't about to let him gain the upper hand. The next day, we met at a secluded coffee shop, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might know us. When I walked in, Charlie was already seated, a calm, confident smile on his face. He looked like a man who had all the cards in his hand. I took a seat across from him, trying to keep my nerves in check. "You've been busy," he said casually, as if we were discussing the weather. "I'm impressed, Ben. Really, I am. But you've stepped into something you don't fully understand." I bristled at his arrogance but forced myself to stay composed. "You've been playing with fire, Charlie. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Charlie leaned back, his smile widening. "Oh, I knew you'd find out. In fact, I was counting on it. You see, Ben, you're not the only one who knows how to play this game. I've been gathering a little information myself." Before I could respond, Charlie slid a folder across the table. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were photographs, emails, and documents, evidence of my surveillance, my attempts to dig into his life. My heart sank as I realized the magnitude of what I was seeing. Charlie had turned the tables on me. "This," Charlie continued, "is enough to ruin you. I've got contacts who would love to get their hands on this. And I'm sure Laura would be thrilled to know just how deep your obsession goes." Anger flared within me, but it was tempered by a cold, creeping fear. Charlie had played me, letting me dig my own grave while he quietly collected the evidence to bury me with. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Charlie leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "It's simple. You back off, or this goes public. Every sordid detail. I'm sure your reputation, and your marriage, won't survive it." I stared at him, my mind racing for a way out. But the truth was, he had me cornered. The power had shifted entirely in his favor. And I was left grasping at straws. As I left the coffee shop, the weight of my failure settled on me like a suffocating blanket. What had started as a quest for revenge had spiraled into a nightmare, and now, I was the one being blackmailed. My desire to destroy Charlie had led me down a path of self-destruction, and I couldn't see a way to reverse the damage. Back at home, I sat in my study, staring at the folder Charlie had given me. The evidence was damning, and the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I was in over my head. I had underestimated Charlie, and now, I was paying the price. As I stared into the darkness, I knew one thing for certain: the game had changed, and if I didn't find a way out, I was going to lose everything. Days passed in a blur, each one darker than the last. Charlie's ultimatum hung over me like a guillotine, ready to drop at any moment. Every time I tried to think of a way out, I hit a wall. He had me trapped, and the pressure was beginning to wear me down. I hadn't confronted Laura yet, but the tension between us was palpable. She sensed something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her. The truth was, I wasn't sure what I would say. My fight for revenge had taken over my life, leaving little room for anything else. At work, I was a shell of myself, going through the motions without truly being present. My colleagues noticed, but I brushed off their concerns. My mind was consumed by thoughts of Charlie, his smug face, and the way he had outmaneuvered me. I was spiraling, and I knew it. One evening, after another sleepless night, I snapped. I couldn't take the pressure any longer. I found myself driving to Charlie's office, my mind racing with a mix of anger and desperation. I didn't have a plan, Just an overwhelming need to confront him, to make him understand that he hadn't won yet. When I arrived, the building was nearly empty, the offices dark except for the faint glow coming from Charlie's corner office. I barged in without knocking, my hands clenched into fists. Charlie looked up from his desk, clearly surprised to see me. "Ben," he began, but I cut him off. "You think you've got me?" I spat, my voice trembling with rage. "You think you can blackmail me and just walk away? I'm not finished with you." Charlie leaned back in his chair, his calm demeanor infuriating me even more. "Ben, you're out of your depth. You've lost. Just accept it." "I'm not accepting anything," I shot back. "You might have something on me, but I'm not the one who started this. You took my wife, you betrayed me, and now you expect me to just roll over?" Charlie sighed, as if dealing with a petulant child. "Ben, I didn't take anything from you. If Laura strayed, that's on her, not me. But you've become obsessed, and it's destroying you." His words cut deep, but I refused to let them sink in. "You don't get to lecture me. You're nothing but a snake, and I'm going to make sure everyone sees you for what you really are." Charlie's expression hardened. "Is that a threat? Because if it is, you're making a big mistake. I'm giving you one last chance to walk away. Otherwise, I'll make sure you lose everything." The finality in his voice sent a chill down my spine. This was it, the breaking point. I realized then that I had two choices: continue down this path of destruction or find a way out before it was too late. But as I stormed out of his office, slamming the door behind me, I knew deep down that I was already in too deep. I had let my anger and hurt drive me to the edge. And now, I was teetering on the brink. As I drove home, the adrenaline began to wear off, replaced by a crushing sense of dread. I had challenged Charlie, but I hadn't gained anything from it. If anything, I had only solidified his resolve to destroy me. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car, staring at the house. The life I once knew was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to stop it. The line between right and wrong had blurred long ago, and now I was left with nothing but a gnawing emptiness. Inside, Laura was waiting, her eyes filled with worry. She opened her mouth to say something, but I walked past her without a word. I couldn't face her, not with the weight of my failure hanging over me. I locked myself in the study, staring at the remnants of my shattered plan. The evidence I had collected against Charlie now seemed pointless, a cruel reminder of how far I had fallen. And as I sat there, the realization finally hit me: I had lost more than just my wife. I had lost myself. The path of revenge I had chosen had led me to this moment, a breaking point from which there might be no return. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and haunted thoughts. The confrontation with Charlie had left me drained, and the realization that I was losing everything slowly consumed me. I had staked everything on revenge, and now I was paying the price. But the worst part was that it wasn't over. Charlie still held all the cards, and I was powerless to stop him from destroying me. My obsession with taking Charlie down had cost me more than I had ever imagined. My work was suffering, my colleagues noticed my erratic behavior, and I could see the concern in their eyes. They whispered behind my back, probably wondering what had happened to the once dependable Ben. But I didn't care. My mind was elsewhere, trapped in the mess I had created. At home, things were even worse. The distance between Laura and me had grown into a chasm. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was with a tone of frustration and sadness. I could tell she knew something was terribly wrong, but I still couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had been so focused on exposing her betrayal that I had become the one hiding secrets. One evening, after another tense and silent dinner, Laura finally confronted me. "Ben, what's going on with you? You've been distant, distracted? You're not yourself." I looked at her, seeing the concern in her eyes. And for a moment, I considered telling her everything. But the words caught in my throat. How could I admit that my quest for revenge had spiraled out of control? How could I confess that I had become the very thing I despised? Instead, I shook my head and muttered, "I'm fine, Laura. Just stressed from work. I'll be okay." She didn't believe me. I could see it in her expression, the way her eyes narrowed with doubt. But she didn't press further, and I was relieved, though I knew it was only temporary. Later that night, I sat in the darkness of the study, staring at the empty whiskey glass in my hand. The silence was deafening, and the loneliness I felt was unbearable. My life had become a prison of my own making, and I was trapped inside, with no way out. As I wallowed in my thoughts, my phone buzzed with a new message. I picked it up, expecting some meaningless work email, but my heart skipped a beat when I saw that it was from Charlie. "Meet me tomorrow. We need to talk." I stared at the message, my mind racing. What did Charlie want now? Had he finally decided to finish what he started? My instincts screamed at me to ignore him, to cut my losses and walk away. But I knew I couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. The next day, I met Charlie at a quiet bar on the outskirts of town. It was dimly lit, the kind of place where no one asks questions. When I walked in, Charlie was already there, nursing a drink. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. "Ben," he said as I sat down, "we need to end this." I said nothing, waiting for him to continue. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This has gone too far. Neither of us is going to win if we keep going down this path." I could barely contain my anger. "You think you can just call a truce after everything you've done? After everything you've put me through?" Charlie shook his head. "This isn't a game, Ben. You've got to understand that. What happened between me and Laura, it was a mistake. But what you're doing, the lengths you've gone to, it's destroying you. And it's going to destroy her too." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been so consumed by my need for revenge that I hadn't stopped to think about the impact it was having on Laura. I had justified my actions by convincing myself that I was the victim, that I was the one who deserved justice. But now, sitting across from Charlie, I realized that my pursuit of vengeance had made me blind to the damage I was causing. Charlie leaned in closer, his voice low and serious. "You have a chance to stop this, Ben. Walk away now, and we both can salvage something from this mess. But if you keep pushing, I'll have no choice but to ruin you. And believe me, I will." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. He was right, this wasn't a game, and I had already lost more than I could afford. But walking away felt like admitting defeat, like letting him get away with everything he had done. Could I really just let it go? Charlie must have sensed my hesitation because he added, "Think about what you have to lose, Ben. Is revenge really worth it?" As I left the bar, Charlie's words echoed in my mind. I had reached the point where I had to make a decision, continue down the path of destruction or cut my losses and try to rebuild what was left of my life. But no matter what I chose, I knew one thing for certain, there was no going back to the way things were. The cost of vengeance had already been too high. The weight of Charlie's ultimatum clung to me like a shroud, suffocating any remnants of clarity I had left. As I drove away from the bar, my mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, regret, and an overwhelming sense of loss. Charlie was right. I had to consider what I had to lose. But could I really walk away after everything that had happened? At home, the tension between Laura and me had become unbearable. Her questions had grown more pointed, her patience wearing thin. She knew something was wrong, something beyond the usual stress I had been blaming for weeks. I couldn't keep up the facade much longer, but the truth felt like a knife in my gut. How could I tell her that my obsession with Charlie had dragged me down into this abyss? I found myself avoiding her, spending more time in the study, pretending to work but really just staring blankly at my computer screen, my thoughts consumed by the mess I had created. The evidence I had gathered on Charlie now seemed like a cruel joke. A testament to my failure rather than a weapon of justice. The next few days passed in a haze. I went through the motions at work, but my mind was elsewhere, lost in the labyrinth of my own making. I barely spoke to anyone, avoiding conversations and eye contact as much as possible. My colleagues kept their distance, sensing that something was seriously wrong, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered now was figuring out what to do next. Late one night, as I sat in the study nursing yet another glass of whiskey, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Laura. She was upstairs in our bedroom, and the text was short, almost pleading. "We need to talk." I knew this moment was inevitable. I couldn't keep running from it. The time had come to face the truth, no matter how ugly it was. I took a deep breath, downed the rest of my drink, and made my way upstairs. Laura was sitting on the edge of the bed, her expression a mix of concern and frustration. When I entered the room, she looked up at me, her eyes searching mine for answers. "Ben," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "what's going on? You're not yourself. You haven't been for a long time. I feel like I'm losing you." I stood there, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on me. The truth was a tidal wave crashing over me, threatening to pull me under. I had been so consumed by my quest for revenge that I had lost sight of everything else: my marriage, my life, my sanity. I sat down next to her, staring at the floor. Laura, I've made some mistakes. Big mistakes. She reached out, taking my hand in hers. What kind of mistakes, Ben? What have you done? The guilt that had been festering inside me finally broke free. I found out about you and Charlie, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I know about the affair. Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears as the reality of my words sank in. Ben, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I nodded, the pain in her voice cutting through me like a knife. I know, Laura, but that's not all. I didn't just find out. I went after him. I tried to destroy him. She looked at me, confusion and fear clouding her eyes. What do you mean? What did you do? I explained everything, how I had gathered evidence, how I had spied on Charlie, how I had planned to use everything I found against him. As the words spilled out, I could see the horror in Laura's eyes growing. This was more than she had ever expected, more than she could have imagined. When I finished, the room was filled with a heavy silence. Laura stared at me, tears streaming down her face. Ben, what have you done? This isn't you. This obsession, it's tearing us apart. I couldn't argue with her. I had let my anger and hurt consume me, turning me into someone I no longer recognized. The man who sat next to her now was a stranger, driven by a need for revenge that had destroyed everything in its path. Laura's voice was barely a whisper as she asked, what happens now? What do we do? I didn't have an answer. The path forward was obscured by the wreckage of my choices, and the realization that I had lost so much in my pursuit of Charlie was almost too much to bear. The descent into this darkness had been gradual, but now I was at the bottom, with no idea how to climb back out. I don't know, Laura, I finally admitted, my voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to fix this. She squeezed my hand, her grip the only thing grounding me in that moment. We'll figure it out, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. We have to. As we sat there in the darkened room, holding on to each other like we were the last lifeline in a raging storm, I realized that the cost of my vengeance had been higher than I could have ever imagined. And now, as the pieces of my life lay shattered around me, I was left with the sobering truth: sometimes, in the pursuit of revenge, you lose more than you ever thought possible. The morning after my confession, the air in the house felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were straining under the weight of the truth. Laura and I moved through the motions of our routine in a silent dance, avoiding each other's eyes, speaking only when necessary. The truth had been laid bare, but the wounds it had caused were still raw, festering beneath the surface. I left for work earlier than usual, eager to escape the suffocating tension. As I drove, my mind replayed the events of the previous night, over and over, like a broken record. Laura's tears, her whispered apologies, her fear, everything was etched into my memory, a constant reminder of how far I had fallen. At the office, I tried to bury myself in work, but it was impossible to focus. Every time I looked at my computer screen, I saw Charlie's smug face, heard his voice taunting me with his final words. Think about what you have to lose, Ben. Is revenge really worth it? I had thought about it. I had weighed the cost, and yet, I was still here, teetering on the edge, unable to let go of the anger and betrayal that had driven me this far. But now, after everything that had happened with Laura, I was beginning to see the truth more clearly. Revenge had consumed me, turned me into someone I no longer recognized, and in the process, I had nearly destroyed everything I loved. But just as I was starting to consider the possibility of letting go, of walking away from this madness, a new message arrived on my phone. It was from Charlie. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it. Ben, we're not finished yet. Meet me tonight at the construction site on Elm Street. 10 p.m. Alone. I stared at the message, my mind racing. What was Charlie playing at? Why was he dragging this out? The rational part of me screamed to ignore him, to delete the message and move on with my life. But another part, the part still clinging to the idea of retribution, wouldn't let me walk away. This was my chance to confront him one last time, to end this once and for all. The day passed in a fog, the hours blurring together as I tried to prepare myself for what was coming. I knew I was walking into a trap, but I didn't care. I had nothing left to lose, or so I thought. As night fell, I drove to the address Charlie had sent, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. The construction site was deserted, a skeletal frame of a building rising out of the shadows, the perfect stage for our final showdown. I parked the car and got out, the cool night air biting at my skin. The site was eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I walked toward the half-finished structure, every step echoing in the darkness. Charlie was waiting for me inside, leaning against a concrete pillar, his face hidden in the shadows. As I approached, he stepped forward, a cold smile on his lips. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You just couldn't let it go, could you?" I clenched my fists, trying to keep my emotions in check. "What do you want, Charlie? Why are we here?" Charlie's smile widened. "I wanted to see how far you'd go. Ben, I wanted to see how much you were willing to lose for your precious revenge. And now, here we are, two men standing on the edge of the abyss." I took a step closer, my anger flaring. "This isn't a game, Charlie. You've pushed me to the limit. What do you want from me?" He shrugged, as if the answer was obvious. "I want you to understand, Ben. I want you to see that you've already lost. You came after me, tried to destroy me, but in the end, you're the one who's been destroyed. Your marriage, your career, your sanity, it's all slipping away, and there's nothing you can do about it." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I refused to back down. "You don't get to decide how this ends, Charlie. You've taken everything from me, but I'm not finished yet." Charlie's expression hardened, the smile fading from his lips. "Oh, but I do get to decide, Ben. And this ends when I say it does." Before I could react, Charlie reached into his coat and pulled out a small, sleek object, a flash drive. He held it up, letting the light from a nearby street lamp glint off its surface. "This," he said, his voice low and menacing, "contains everything I've gathered on you. Every misstep, every mistake, every piece of evidence you thought was buried. I have it all, Ben. And if you push me any further, I'll make sure everyone sees it." I stared at the flash drive, my blood turning to ice. He had me completely. Everything I had done to him, everything I had tried to use against him, had now been turned back on me. The trap had been set, and I had walked right into it. Charlie took a step closer, his eyes locked on mine. "You can walk away now, Ben. Leave it all behind, and I'll let you go. But if you keep coming after me, I'll destroy you. And this time, there will be no coming back." The words echoed in my mind, the finality of his threat sinking in. He was offering me a way out, a chance to escape the nightmare I had created. But at what cost? Could I really walk away, knowing that Charlie would get away with everything he had done? For a moment, I considered fighting back, risking it all to take him down. But as I stood there, staring into the eyes of the man who had outplayed me at every turn, I realized that the battle was over. I had lost, and continuing down this path would only bring more pain, more destruction. Slowly, I nodded, the weight of my defeat crushing me. "Fine," I said, my voice hollow. "You win, Charlie. I'll walk away." Charlie's smile returned, satisfied and triumphant. He pocketed the flash drive and turned to leave. "Good choice, Ben. You've saved yourself from a lot of pain." As he walked away, disappearing into the shadows, I stood there, alone in the dark, the full scope of my defeat washing over me. I had thought I was fighting for justice, for some sense of retribution, but in the end, all I had done was destroy myself. The tide had turned, and now, all that was left was the wreckage of the life I once knew. I had lost everything, my marriage, my dignity, my sanity, and now, I was left to pick up the pieces, alone and broken. The drive home felt like a funeral procession. The silence in the car was suffocating, only interrupted by the occasional rumble of the engine as I shifted gears. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The realization of what I had done, of the depths to which I had sunk, gnawed at me like a relentless parasite. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I didn't move. I just sat there, staring blankly at the dashboard. I could see the glow of the lights inside the house. The place that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a tomb. The thought of facing Laura again was unbearable. How could I explain this to her? How could I make her understand what I had become? Eventually, I forced myself out of the car, my legs heavy as I trudged to the front door. The house was eerily quiet as I stepped inside, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet. I half expected Laura to be waiting for me, demanding answers, but the living room was empty. A small part of me was relieved, but another part was disappointed. Maybe it was better this way, Maybe I didn't deserve her anger or her questions. Maybe I didn't deserve anything at all. I headed straight for the study, the one room in the house where I felt I could still hide. As I closed the door behind me, I let out a long breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The room was dimly lit, the shadows casting long, dark shapes across the walls. I sank into the chair behind my desk, my mind racing but going nowhere. I knew I had to confront the reality of what had happened. Charlie had beaten me, outmaneuvered me at every turn, and now he held all the cards. The flash drive he had shown me was a time bomb, ready to explode and destroy whatever was left of my life. I had no leverage, no way to fight back, and the worst part was, I had brought it all upon myself. I buried my face in my hands, the weight of my failure pressing down on me like a ton of bricks. I had started this journey believing I was seeking justice, but in the end, I had become a monster, no better than the man I had tried to destroy. The irony was bitter, almost laughable. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to stand up. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls suffocating me with their silence. I needed air. I needed to get out. I found myself back in the kitchen, staring blankly at the countertops. My thoughts still a swirling mess. I didn't know where Laura was, and at that moment, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet and poured myself a generous glass. The burn of the alcohol as it slid down my throat was a welcome distraction from the gnawing emptiness inside me. As I downed the drink, my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen, half expecting it to be another message from Charlie, but it wasn't. It was from Laura. "We need to talk, now." The message was simple, direct. I stared at it for a long moment, the implications sinking in. She knew something was wrong, something beyond what I had already confessed. And she wasn't going to let it slide. I took the bottle of whiskey with me as I made my way upstairs, each step feeling like a march to the gallows. The light was on in our bedroom, and as I pushed the door open, I found Laura sitting on the bed, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked up at me, her gaze piercing. "Ben, what's going on? What's really going on?" I didn't have the energy to lie, to fabricate another story. I was done with deception. So I sat down on the edge of the bed, the bottle of whiskey still clutched in my hand, and I told her everything. I told her about my meeting with Charlie, about the flash drive, about the threats. I laid it all out, sparing no details, letting the full horror of my actions spill out into the open. The words came slowly at first, but once they started, I couldn't stop. Laura listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When I finally finished, the room was filled with a heavy, oppressive silence. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just stared at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief, hurt, and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Ben, how did we get here? How did we let it come to this?" I didn't have an answer. How could I explain the madness that had consumed me? That had driven me to destroy everything we had built together? How could I justify the choices I had made, the path I had taken? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice cracking. "I don't know, Laura. I lost control. I couldn't stop myself." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "This isn't the man I married. This isn't you." Her words cut deep, each one a knife twisting in my gut. She was right. I wasn't the man she had married. I wasn't the man I had once been. I was a shell, hollowed out by my own obsession, my own need for revenge. "I don't know who I am anymore," I admitted, the truth of it hitting me like a sledgehammer. "I don't know how to fix this." Laura wiped her eyes, her expression softening slightly. "Maybe we can't fix it. Maybe we're too far gone." The possibility of losing her, of losing everything, was a terrifying thought. But as I looked into her eyes, I realized that she was right. We had been spiraling downward for so long. And now we were standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss. "I don't want to lose you," I said, my voice barely audible. "But I don't know how to stop this." She reached out, placing a hand on mine. "Ben, we've both made mistakes. But we need to decide if we're going to keep making them, or if we're going to find a way to move forward." Her words were like a lifeline, offering a glimmer of hope in the darkness. But that hope was fragile, easily shattered by the reality of our situation. I had pushed us to the brink, and now it was up to us to decide whether we would fall or find a way to climb back up. "I want to move forward," I said finally, the words heavy with the weight of everything that had come before. I just don't know if we can. Laura squeezed my hand, her grip firm, reassuring. We won't know unless we try. But we can't do it alone, Ben. We need to do it together, or not at all. I nodded, the truth of her words sinking in. We were at a crossroads, and the path we chose now would determine the rest of our lives. The road ahead was uncertain. Charlie nodded. Yes, Ben, I'm letting you go. Consider it a parting gift. There was a strange finality in his tone, a sense that this really was the end. But instead of relief, all I felt was a deep, hollow emptiness. This was what I had fought for, what I had sacrificed so much to achieve, and now that it was over, I was left with nothing but the ashes of what used to be my life. As Charlie turned to leave, I found myself speaking before I could stop myself. Why did you do it, Charlie? Why put us through all of this? He paused, turning back to face me, a faint smile on his lips. Because I could. Because I wanted to see if you were really as strong as you thought you were. And in the end, you proved that you're just as weak as the rest of us. With that, he walked away, disappearing into the night. I stood there, alone with the flash drive in my hand, the final piece of the puzzle that I had spent so long chasing. But now, it felt meaningless, a hollow victory in a war that had left both sides shattered. When I finally got home, Laura was waiting for me, sitting on the couch with a look of quiet resignation on her face. She didn't ask where I had been or what had happened, she didn't need to. We both knew that whatever was left of our marriage was hanging by a thread. I sat down beside her, the flash drive heavy in my pocket. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, laden with the weight of everything that had transpired. Finally, I pulled out the flash drive and placed it on the coffee table in front of us. It's over, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Laura looked at the flash drive, then at me, her expression unreadable. And now what, Ben? What do we do now? I didn't have an answer. The battle with Charlie might have been over, but the war within myself was just beginning. I had been consumed by revenge, driven to the brink of madness, and now, in the aftermath, I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that I had almost destroyed. I don't know, I admitted, the words bitter on my tongue. I don't know how to fix this, Laura. I don't even know if it can be fixed. She reached out, placing her hand over mine. Her touch was warm, grounding me in a way that I hadn't felt in a long time. We'll figure it out, she said softly. Together. The path ahead was uncertain, the future clouded by the shadows of our past. But as I sat there with Laura, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for redemption, for healing. It wouldn't be easy, nothing worth having ever was, but for the first time in a long time, I was willing to try. And that, I thought, as I looked into Laura's eyes, was the first step toward reclaiming what we had lost. It was the first step toward finding our way back to each other, to the life we had once known. As we sat there, hand in hand, I knew that the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but it was a journey we would take together. And for now, that was enough. In the days that followed, Laura and I fell into a routine that felt almost surreal, as if we were trying to convince ourselves that we could return to the life we once had. We went through the motions, cooking dinner together, watching television in the evenings, even laughing at the same old jokes, but there was an unspoken understanding between us that things were far from normal. The flash drive sat untouched on the coffee table, a constant reminder of the line I had crossed, the point of no return. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, everything I had lost in my quest for vengeance. And yet, despite the overwhelming urge to destroy it, I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt like an anchor, tethering me to the reality I had created, a reality I couldn't escape. Laura never asked about it, never questioned what I intended to do. She was giving me space, allowing me to come to terms with everything in my own time, but I could see the worry in her eyes, the fear that this fragile peace between us was only temporary. I couldn't blame her, I felt it too. One night, after yet another silent dinner, Laura suggested we take a walk. The air was crisp, a slight chill in the early autumn breeze. We walked side by side, our hands occasionally brushing against each other, but neither of us made the move to hold hands. The distance between us, though small, felt insurmountable. As we walked through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, the sound of our footsteps on the pavement filled the silence. I could feel Laura glancing at me, as if waiting for me to say something, to break the tension that had settled over us like a heavy fog. But I didn't know where to start, didn't know how to begin to explain the turmoil inside me. Finally, Laura stopped, turning to face me. Her eyes searched mine, and I could see the pain, the uncertainty etched into her expression. "Ben, we can't keep doing this," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We can't pretend everything is okay when it's not. We need to talk about what happened, about where we go from here." I knew she was right. We had been tiptoeing around the elephant in the room, hoping it would somehow disappear on its own, but it was time to confront it. Time to face the truth of what we had become. "I know," I said, the words heavy on my tongue. "I've been avoiding it because I'm scared, Laura. I'm scared that if we really talk about everything, we'll realize that we can't fix this. That we're too far gone." Her expression softened, and she reached out, taking my hand in hers. "I'm scared too," she admitted. "But we can't keep running from it. We need to decide if we're going to fight for us, or if we're going to let this destroy us." The weight of her words settled over me, and I felt a lump forming in my throat. I squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her touch. "I don't want to lose you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know if I can fix what I've done." Laura shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "It's not just you, Ben. We both made mistakes. We both let things get out of control. But if we're going to move forward, we need to be honest with each other. Even if it hurts." I took a deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs. This was the moment of truth, the moment when we had to decide whether we would fight for our marriage or let it crumble under the weight of everything we had been through. "Okay," I said finally, my voice steadying. "Let's talk. Let's be honest, no matter how hard it is." We continued walking, this time side by side, our hands still clasped together. The words came slowly at first, but once we started, it felt like a dam had broken. And everything we had been holding back came pouring out. We talked about the affair, about the lies, the betrayal, and the hurt. We talked about the mistakes we had made, the things we had both done that had driven us apart. It was painful, raw, and there were moments when I thought the weight of it all would crush us, but we kept going, kept pushing through the pain. Laura didn't hold back, and neither did I. We laid everything bare, exposing the wounds that had festered for so long, allowing them to finally begin to heal. It wasn't easy. There were tears, accusations, and moments of silence so thick that it felt like the world had stopped spinning. But through it all, there was a sense of relief, a sense that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. By the time we returned home, the tension between us had lessened, replaced by a fragile but real sense of understanding. We had finally faced the truth, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, it felt like we had taken the first real step toward healing. That night, as we lay in bed, Laura curled up against me, her breathing steady and calm. I stared up at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything we had talked about, everything we still needed to work through. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope, a hope that we could rebuild what had been broken, that we could find a way to move forward together. It wouldn't be easy, and there were no guarantees. But I was willing to try. We both were. And that, I realized, was the beginning of something new. The beginning of the end of our old life, and the start of whatever came next. The days after our late-night conversation were filled with an odd mix of hope and unease. Laura and I were working to rebuild our lives, but the shadow of Charlie and everything that had happened still loomed over us. It was as if we were walking on a tightrope, carefully balancing our fragile progress with the knowledge that one misstep could send everything crashing down. At first, it seemed like we were making progress. We were more open with each other, sharing our thoughts and fears in a way we hadn't in years. There was a sense of cautious optimism between us, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we could put the past behind us and start anew. But beneath the surface, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was like an itch at the back of my mind, a gnawing suspicion that no matter how hard we tried, the damage had already been done. The flash drive sat untouched in a drawer, and though I never spoke of it, its presence was a constant reminder of the dark path I had walked down. One evening, as I was working late in my office, my phone buzzed with a message. I glanced at the screen, expecting a text from Laura, but instead saw an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat as I opened the message. "You really thought you could just walk away?" The words were like a punch to the gut. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. It had to be Charlie. Who else could it be? But why now? Why reach out after all this time? Another message followed, this time with an attachment. My hands trembled as I opened it, and my stomach churned as I saw the images. They were of me, taken without my knowledge, documenting my every move over the past few days. Leaving the office, meeting with clients, even walking through the park with Laura. It was clear that someone had been watching me, tracking my every step. I have more. Much more, the next message read. Unless you want Laura to see everything, you know what you need to do. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. This was it. The unraveling of everything I had tried to build, the final card that Charlie had been holding all along. I thought I had escaped his grasp, but now I realized that I had been living in a false sense of security, a brief reprieve before the inevitable downfall. I didn't respond to the messages, my mind too clouded with fear and anger to think clearly. Instead, I sat there in my office, staring at the images on my phone, trying to process what had just happened. The fear that had been lurking in the back of my mind all this time was now front and center, an inescapable reality that I couldn't ignore. How had I been so blind? How had I let my guard down, thinking that Charlie would simply walk away? I should have known better, I should have anticipated this, but instead, I had allowed myself to believe that we were safe. I couldn't let Laura find out. The thought of her seeing those images, of her realizing the extent of what I had done, was too much to bear. It would destroy whatever progress we had made, shattering the fragile hope we had been clinging to. I had to do something, had to stop Charlie before he could tear everything apart. But what could I do? I was already in too deep, already compromised in ways I hadn't even realized. I was out of options, out of time, and Charlie had me right where he wanted me. As the hours ticked by, I realized that I had no choice. If I wanted to protect Laura, to save what little remained of our life together, I had to play Charlie's game. I had to follow his demands, whatever they were, even if it meant losing everything else in the process. But as I sat there, staring at the messages on my phone, a new thought began to take shape in my mind. Maybe this wasn't just about protecting Laura. Maybe this was about something deeper, something darker. Maybe this was about confronting the demons that had driven me to this point, about facing the consequences of my actions head on. I didn't know what Charlie wanted, but I knew that whatever it was, it would be the final test, the last chance to either redeem myself or fall completely into the abyss. And as much as I feared what was to come, I knew that I couldn't run from it any longer. I had to face Charlie, had to face myself, and whatever the outcome, I had to be prepared to live with it. With a heavy heart, I typed out a response. "What do you want, Charlie?" The message was sent, and all I could do now was wait. The ball was in Charlie's court, and whatever move he made next would decide everything. As I stared at the phone, waiting for the reply that would inevitably come, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This was it, the moment of truth. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was ready to face it. The waiting was unbearable. Every minute felt like an hour, each passing second stretched thin with anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was hanging in the balance, teetering on the edge of a precipice. Charlie had been quiet after my last message, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. The next day, as I walked into the office, I found myself constantly checking my phone, hoping for a message, dreading what it might contain. My work suffered, I was distracted, my mind replaying the images, the threats, the fear of what might come next. In the late afternoon, a new message arrived from Charlie. I opened it with trembling fingers. "Meet me tonight at the old warehouse. Midnight. Come alone." The message was blunt, devoid of any unnecessary detail. I knew this was the endgame, the final confrontation with Charlie. The warehouse was the same place where we had first met, the place where everything had begun. It was fitting that it would be the setting for the conclusion of this twisted game. That evening, I tried to act normal, but the pretense was painful. Laura sensed my unease, but I deflected her questions with vague reassurances. I couldn't afford to tell her the truth. She would be caught in the crossfire of a battle I was determined to fight alone. When midnight came, I drove to the warehouse, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The streets were empty, the city silent as if holding its breath in anticipation. The warehouse loomed ahead, an imposing silhouette against the night sky. I parked my car and approached the entrance, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside, the warehouse was as desolate as ever. The flickering light of a single bulb cast eerie shadows across the concrete floor. I could hear my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness as I moved forward, each step amplifying my growing anxiety. Charlie was already there, standing in the center of the room, his back turned to me. As I approached, he turned slowly, his expression unreadable. He held a folder in his hand, the contents hidden from view. "You came," he said, his tone flat. "I didn't expect you to actually show up." I didn't reply, my gaze fixed on the folder. "What do you want, Charlie?" Charlie smiled, a cold, calculated smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "I want to finish what we started. This is the final act, Ben. After tonight, it will all be over." He opened the folder, revealing a stack of photographs and documents. My stomach churned as I recognized some of the images. They were of Laura, taken without her knowledge, just like the ones from before. There were also documents, contracts, and other sensitive material that I had never seen. "This," Charlie said, gesturing to the folder, "is everything. All the evidence, all the dirt. I have enough to destroy your life. To expose everything you've tried so hard to hide." I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing as I tried to process what was happening. "Why are you showing me this?" Charlie shrugged, a casual gesture that belied the gravity of the situation. "Because I want you to understand the stakes. You've pushed me to this point, Ben. I've kept my end of the bargain, now it's your turn." "What do you want from me?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Charlie's gaze hardened. "I want you to acknowledge your defeat. I want you to admit that you're powerless against me. And then, I want you to walk away from this life, from Laura, from everything you've built. Leave it all behind." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. This was more than just a final confrontation, it was a demand for complete surrender. Charlie wanted to break me, to make me relinquish everything I had fought for. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "And if I refuse?" Charlie's smile widened, a glint of menace in his eyes. "Then I'll make sure Laura sees every single one of these photographs. I'll ensure that the truth comes out, that your life unravels completely." The threat was clear, and it was more than I could bear. The thought of Laura being dragged into this mess, of her finding out everything, was a crushing blow. I couldn't let that happen, not after everything we had been through. "All right," I said finally, my voice heavy with resignation. "I'll do it. I'll walk away. But you have to promise me that Laura won't find out." Charlie's eyes narrowed, a glimmer of satisfaction in them. "You have my word. But remember, Ben, this is your final chance. If you ever try to cross me again, if you ever try to fight back, I will make sure that you and Laura both pay the price." I nodded, the weight of defeat settling heavily on my shoulders. I had no choice but to comply, to walk away from everything I had worked for. The realization that I was powerless, that I had been outmaneuvered at every turn, was a bitter pill to swallow. Charlie gathered the documents and handed me a copy of everything, his expression a mixture of triumph and cold indifference. "Now go," he said. "Leave this place and never come back." I left the warehouse, the finality of it all sinking in. The night air felt cold and empty, reflecting the hollow feeling inside me. I had lost the fight, lost my sense of control, and worst of all, lost the chance to rebuild what had been broken. As I drove away, I glanced back at the warehouse. The place where it all began and where it had ended. I knew that the path ahead would be difficult, that the consequences of my actions would follow me for a long time. But for now, all I could do was try to pick up the pieces of my shattered life and hope that, in time, I could find a way to move forward, even if it meant leaving behind everything I had once held dear. The days that followed the confrontation with Charlie were a blur of regret and emptiness. I kept my promise, walking away from everything I had worked for. Everything I had built with Laura. The sense of defeat was overwhelming, a heavy weight that I couldn't shake off, no matter how hard I tried. I had resigned from my job, sold the house, and moved into a small, nondescript apartment in a different part of town. I was determined to stay out of the limelight, to keep a low profile, and to avoid drawing any attention to myself. It felt like a self-imposed exile, a way to escape the consequences of my actions and the mistakes I had made. Laura remained in the house we had shared, trying to rebuild her life without me. We had agreed to part ways quietly, without further conflict. I knew that she deserved better, that she needed space to heal and to move on, but the reality of our separation was a constant, painful reminder of what I had lost. The apartment was sparsely furnished, a stark contrast to the home I had once known. It was as if I had stripped away every comfort, every sign of familiarity, in an attempt to distance myself from the life I had once led. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, and the silence was deafening. I spent my days working odd jobs, trying to keep busy and avoid dwelling on the past. The work was menial and unfulfilling, but it allowed me to keep my mind occupied and to avoid the temptation of slipping back into old habits. I knew that if I let myself linger too long in the past, I would only be reminded of the choices I had made and the consequences I now faced. Despite my efforts to stay out of sight, I found myself haunted by memories of the past. The warehouse, the confrontation with Charlie, the look of betrayal in Laura's eyes, it all replayed in my mind, a relentless loop of regret and sorrow. I couldn't escape the feeling that I had been trapped in a cycle of my own making, a cycle that had led me to this point of utter desolation. One evening, as I sat alone in my dimly lit apartment, a knock on the door jolted me from my thoughts. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, unsure of who might be there. To my surprise, it was Emily, an old friend from my previous life. Her face was lined with concern, and her eyes held a sadness that mirrored my own. "Ben," she said softly, stepping into the apartment. "I've been trying to reach you. I heard about everything that happened and I wanted to see how you're doing." Her presence was both a comfort and a reminder of the life I had left behind. We sat together in the small living room, exchanging awkward pleasantries before the conversation turned to more serious matters. "I don't even know where to begin," I admitted, my voice heavy with emotion. "Everything's fallen apart, and I don't know how to make sense of it all." Emily nodded, her expression sympathetic. "It's been a rough road, hasn't it? I can't even imagine what you're going through." We talked for hours, sharing stories and memories, trying to find some semblance of normalcy in the midst of the chaos. Emily's presence was a reminder that, despite everything, there were still people who cared. Still connections to the past that hadn't been completely severed. As the night wore on, I found myself opening up to her in ways I hadn't with anyone else. I spoke of the affair, the blackmail, the loss of everything I had worked for. I spoke of the guilt and the regret, the overwhelming sense of having been defeated by my own actions. Emily listened quietly, offering support and understanding without judgment. It was a rare comfort in a world that had become increasingly isolating. "You know," she said gently, "you've been through a lot. It's going to take time to heal, to come to terms with everything that's happened. But you don't have to do it alone. There are people who want to help you, who want to see you find a way forward." Her words were a balm to my wounded spirit. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a faint possibility that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to rebuild my life, to find some sense of purpose and direction. The next few weeks were a process of adjustment, of learning to live with the consequences of my choices and to find a new path forward. Emily's visits became a regular occurrence, a source of support and a reminder that there was still a chance for redemption. I began to explore new opportunities, taking on different types of work and seeking out ways to rebuild my life from the ground up. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of deep sorrow and regret, but I knew that I had to keep moving forward, no matter how difficult it was. In the end, the cost of defeat was high, and the road to recovery was long and arduous. But with each passing day, I began to find small moments of hope and renewal. The journey was far from over, but I was learning to navigate the challenges, to face the consequences of my actions, and to seek a path to a new beginning. It had been several months since that fateful night at the warehouse. The weight of the past still lingered, but I was starting to see glimpses of light breaking through the darkness. My new life, though far from perfect, was beginning to take shape. The small apartment that had once felt so confining now seemed like a sanctuary. It was modest, but it was mine, a place where I could begin to rebuild. The days of working odd jobs were gradually giving way to more stable employment. I had found a new job with a small firm, one that didn't come with the prestige or the paycheck of my old position but offered a fresh start and a chance to prove myself. I had also taken up a new hobby, something that seemed trivial but was surprisingly therapeutic: painting. It was a way to channel my emotions, to express the feelings I had been holding in for so long. My work was far from extraordinary, but it provided a sense of accomplishment and a much-needed distraction. One morning, as I sat in my apartment, sipping coffee and reviewing my schedule for the day, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello, Ben?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, but it was unmistakably familiar. It was Laura. I hadn't heard from her since our separation, and the sudden call took me by surprise. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to keep my composure. Yes, Laura, it's me. I hope this isn't a bad time, she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I wanted to reach out, to see how you've been. Her words were both a comfort and a challenge. The thought of speaking with her, of reopening old wounds, was daunting. But there was a sincerity in her tone that I couldn't ignore. It's been a challenging time, I admitted. But I'm managing. How about you? I've been doing well, all things considered, Laura replied. I've been working on getting my life back together, just like you. It hasn't been easy, but I'm trying to move forward. We talked for a while, catching up on the details of our separate lives. It was a difficult conversation, filled with awkward pauses and unspoken emotions, but it was also a step towards closure. We both acknowledged the pain and the loss. But we also recognized the need to move forward, to find a way to heal. As the conversation drew to a close, Laura's voice softened. Ben, I know things ended badly between us, but I want you to know that I wish you the best. I hope you find happiness and peace. Her words were a bittersweet comfort, a recognition of the shared history and the mutual desire to move on. I could feel a sense of closure settling over me, a final acknowledgement of the end of our chapter together. Thank you, Laura, I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside. I wish you the same. After hanging up, I sat in silence for a while, reflecting on the conversation. It felt like a chapter had closed, not just in our relationship but in my own life. I had come to terms with the past and was finally ready to embrace the future. In the weeks that followed, I continued to focus on my new job and my painting. The stability of routine was a welcome change, and I found myself gradually adjusting to a new rhythm of life. I was learning to live with the consequences of my past actions but also to appreciate the small victories of the present. One sunny afternoon, as I stood on the balcony of my apartment, looking out at the city below, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The journey had been arduous, filled with setbacks and moments of despair, but it was also a journey of growth and self-discovery. I had lost a lot along the way, but I had also gained a deeper understanding of myself and the strength to rebuild. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was no longer defined by my past mistakes. I was forging a new path, one that was uniquely my own. As the sun set and the city lights began to sparkle, I felt a sense of hope for the future. It wasn't a grand, sweeping change, but a quiet, steady belief that things could get better. I was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that I had the strength to face it. And so, as the world outside continued to spin, I took a deep breath and stepped into the new dawn of my life. Ready to see where the future would lead.